This next part, we're going to be going over like the different keyframe properties, how to place them, and then hopefully it's not too dry. Feels like it's becoming less and less easy to explain this editor, as now the tutorial will be up to 20 minutes. Probably like another 20 more after this, so I'm sorry. But it'll all be done. It'll all be documented. I'm going to be going over keyframes, how to place them, their different properties, and just some general information about them and how they work. And maybe in the next part, I think I'll do like sample shots. I have a ton of time to record and edit this, so it might be kind of thrown together, but get into it again. I am going to assume that you watched everything in the first video, so I'm not really going to be repeating myself unless I think it's something absolutely necessary to repeat. Keyframes can be a lot of fun to get different shots that you like and look cool, but they can also be a little frustrating, a little hard to understand, and there's some things with them that just don't work altogether no matter how hard you try. So if you're working with them, don't get too discouraged or don't focus in too much on them. Some things just aren't worth it. But they actually are. Make your dreams come true. If you don't know what a keyframe is, it is just the position of the camera at a certain angle at certain spots on the timeline. So placing a keyframe here at this angle and here at this angle will allow the keyframe to move between those 2 points following the playhead. To add a keyframe, press spacebar. To delete a keyframe, either press delete or double click it on the timeline. You want to jump to a keyframe, a single click on the timeline where that keyframe is placed will jump to that keyframe. But as we talked about in the first video, remember to always resume the playhead a little bit so that when you jump, it actually matches where it is on the timeline. You can use 0.1x speed to do this. To add a keyframe, it places a camera at the same position and angle as you see on your screen, at the playhead in the timeline. This will be actual physical camera as you can see when you're in edit mode. So we can press spacebar to add a keyframe, and we can move down the timeline and we can add another keyframe, and the camera should follow between those 2 keyframes as the playhead moves along. Once the playhead has reached a keyframe, it will look for the next keyframe to go to, or it will just stop. As of this point, we haven't really talked about the different types of keyframes. We are just dealing with the basic default keyframe, which all it does is capture the frame, and it doesn't track or follow the car in any way. We'll get to that a little bit later, but it has a tendency to lag actual playback. So if you were to center your keyframe on the car and press play, it will lag behind the car, and you can counter this by trying to lead the car a little bit forward and place your keyframe there so that when it lags, it actually centers on the car. But this can be a little bit difficult to do, but it's something to keep in mind. We'll get into different ways of how we can get around that later. Another quick way you can counter this is you can change the speed and keep it at 0.1x or 0.5x to help the camera stay in frame a little better. I also mentioned this in part 1. It's just generally better to record in 0.1 or 0.5x speed because you can always speed up the clips in editing software after the fact, and you'll get better footage in-game that translates better to editing later. Now, remember what I said about when you place a keyframe, in edit mode, you'll actually see a physical camera. What you will also see is lines connecting the cameras, and they will be showing, that's basically the travel path of the camera. So you can see if a line is going directly through a wall or through a tree or somewhere you don't want to go. That's where it will show when you try to do playback out of edit mode. So if you're not paying attention to where you place your keyframes, then you might kind of get like weird spins where it goes all the way around, or kind of clipping through walls and it doesn't look very good, or it clips underneath the road. It's just something you have to keep in mind as you're placing them. And if you look for an issue, if you have an issue, you can always go into edit mode and you can look at the travel paths and add a keyframe in between and change the trajectory of the path by just adding more keyframes. I think with that, we can move on to the next part, which is the different kinds of keyframes and different keyframe properties. So just to blitz through these really quick, each keyframe has 6 different properties that can be used. 7th is unusable in the game right now and probably never going to be usable. But from top to bottom, we have instant, position, rotation, FOV, DOF, relative to, and look at. You can see that some of them have checkboxes or numbers beside them, and we'll get into that very soon, very shortly. If you check instant, there will be no travel towards the keyframe. It will just appear and continue its keyframes from there. So you could use it as kind of a jump cut. You could use several in a row and go boom, 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 or just kind of have one that breaks up the path of the camera travel. Position keyframe. Delete this keyframe. It will not track the position of the camera you placed. Rotation records the rotation of the camera. If you were to delete this keyframe, the camera would just not rotate. FOV tracks your field of view, which is just going to be zooming in and zooming out, more or less. And if you delete it, it will also not track that. DOF is depth of field, and it is not usable, and it probably won't ever be used, so you can just ignore it. It doesn't really mean anything. Relative to plants the camera at a relative spot to a car, either car 1 or car 2. Car 1 being the player's car, car 2 being the opponent's car. It is not host versus client. Car 1 just refers to your car, and car 2 refers to the opponent's car. That's it. If you set up the relative to camera at a certain angle facing the car, it would stay locked on that position indefinitely for the entire run until you designate another keyframe otherwise. Look at simply points the camera always at either car 1 or car 2. It is different than relative to. Relative to plants the car at an angle relative to those cars. Look at will look directly at that car. One quick note, when you place a keyframe, you will notice that relative to and look at are never checked. To check them, you have to sometimes scroll in on the timeline and just double click them, and that adds the keyframe. Now, this part I don't 100% know about for sure to say for certain, but when, let's say you add a keyframe at a specific angle, and later you decide you want to add relative to or look at, and you come back to it, I feel like you have to reposition the camera back at that exact same spot, or else adding the relative to or the look at will change the angle of the original keyframe. It'll overwrite the properties to the newest one that you've dropped in. I don't know 100%, I haven't done enough testing, but I feel like that's the case. Note that adding relative to and look at keyframes is a little bit buggy. Sometimes if you have keyframes that are too close together, you will not be able to double click and add those keyframes. Sometimes it's just limited that way. You also have to keep in mind around clicking, when you're clicking back and forth between keyframes, that if you accidentally double click one, it'll delete it. So make sure you do single clicks, because if you double click them and delete them, it's really a pain to go back and fix them. There is no Control Z, so be careful. Gotta have that trigger discipline. So with relative to and look at, you can type in the car's number 1 or 2, and that changes which car it's going to apply to. The checkboxes on position and rotation apply to smoothing. So smoothing kind of blends the camera angles together and makes it more smooth, but that is actually what creates the lagging effect in the first place. So it's kind of like when you press play, it's like kind of picking it up and like slowly dragging it and bringing it up to speed, which might be a nice effect from time to time, but other times it might just ruin your shot and make it really hard to get the cars in the angle. So you can uncheck those, and the camera will actually position exactly where you put the keyframe, and it will not deviate, but it will be a little more jittery. And general rules of thumb to reduce the jitteriness is place the keyframes farther apart instead of very close together, and it will go on kind of a wide arc all the way to the next position instead of trying to move really tight and shift like that at different speeds. That's what can look jarring. I think relative to and look at are probably the two hardest to understand or explain, but they make a lot of sense and they're really easy to understand once you see examples of them. Another thing that can get really tricky is you can have all these keyframes and you can remove, say, position and rotation, but keep relative to and uncheck smooth and do different kinds of combinations, and it can get kind of confusing to figure out exactly what the editor is going to do. But that's, I don't know, either depending on how you look at it, it's either the fun of it or... And I think that's probably a pretty good place to stop this one. There's probably a few things I missed, but I can pick those up in probably parts 3 and maybe 4. We'll see. Next, I kind of want to go into different shots. You can do different ways to approach placing keyframes and more practical examples, which is, I don't know, maybe people can just skip to that in the first place. We'll see. I'll see you in the next one. Yeah. Concha. Baj baj.